For more than a decade, the quiet neighborhood of Waco, Texas, carried the image of stability, family life, and tradition. Tucked between modest one-story homes and wide streets lined with oak trees, the community rarely saw more than minor disputes, car accidents, or the occasional burglary. Residents were accustomed to their routines: Sunday church gatherings, summer barbecues, and late-night talks on front porches. Against this backdrop lived a couple who, at first glance, fit the profile of an ordinary marriage: Michael Sanders and his wife, Laura. They had been married for 10 years, having tied the knot in June 2012, in a small ceremony attended only by family and close friends. Over the years, their lives seemed to unfold in predictable ways: modest, steady, and almost uneventful. Michael was a Texas native, born and raised in Waco, where the strong values of faith, masculinity, and community shaped much of his upbringing. He worked as a mechanic at a local auto shop, respected for his skill with engines and his dependable nature. To those who knew him, Michael was steady, perhaps a little quiet, but overall a man who loved routine. Laura, on the other hand, carried a more mysterious air. She moved to Waco in her late 20s, a few years before marrying Michael. Unlike her husband, she had no extended family in the area and spoke little about her past. She presented herself as a woman who had gone through struggles but was now focused on building a peaceful future. To the neighborhood, she was polite, reserved, and occasionally joined community activities, though she never fully opened up about her background. Throughout their marriage, Michael and Laura maintained the appearance of a stable couple. Neighbors often saw them together, shopping for groceries on Saturday mornings or attending local fairs in the summer. Their home, a modest beige house on the corner of Cedar Ridge Drive, became a symbol of ordinary domestic life. Yet beneath the calm exterior, there were elements of Laura's past that Michael never questioned in detail. She occasionally deflected questions about her earlier years, explaining only that she had gone through difficult times before moving to Texas. Michael, comfortable in his role as a husband and provider, never pushed further. Over the years, their life seemed uneventful but steady. They faced the usual stresses of marriage: financial challenges, occasional arguments, and the monotony of routine, but nothing that suggested serious cracks. Laura worked part-time as a receptionist at a dental clinic, and Michael's steady income from the auto shop provided enough to keep their modest household afloat. They did not have children, something that friends sometimes whispered about, but the couple usually brushed off such conversations, saying it was a matter of choice. For years, no one pressed further, and no one suspected that the absence of children might be linked to something Laura had chosen not to reveal. By 2021, nearly a decade into their marriage, Michael and Laura appeared to be settled into a rhythm of life that felt permanent. Their 10th wedding anniversary was marked by a quiet dinner at a local steakhouse on June 15th. Nothing about that night suggested trouble. Michael gave Laura a simple necklace and Laura smiled, thanking him for his loyalty and years together. To outsiders, they remained a picture of quiet endurance, neither glamorous nor troubled, simply ordinary. Yet beneath the surface, a hidden truth remained, buried in the shadows of Laura's past. For years, she had kept a part of herself carefully guarded, a truth sealed away in medical records and legal documents she believed would never resurface. It was not an act of deception born from malice, but from survival. Laura had been born male but had transitioned decades earlier, long before meeting Michael. She had lived fully as a woman, working, socializing, and eventually marrying without revisiting the past she had left behind. Her identity was complete in her eyes, and the life she built with Michael felt real and valid. She had no reason to believe the truth would ever come out. But secrets, no matter how deeply buried, carry the weight of inevitability. And in the humid summer of 2022, 10 years after they vowed to stay together for better or for worse, a chance discovery would set in motion a chain of events that would not only end their marriage but shock the entire state of Texas. At its heart lay the collision between truth, identity, and the fragile balance of trust in a marriage that had lasted a decade without suspicion. What followed was not just a crime of passion but a story that raised questions about identity, honesty, and the devastating consequences when hidden truths come to light. On the surface, the Sanders household in Waco, Texas, gave no hint of turmoil. Their beige, single-story home with its neat front yard was unremarkable, blending seamlessly into the row of similar houses on Cedar Ridge Drive. Neighbors described Michael and Laura Sanders as quiet, reserved, and private. They waved politely, attended occasional church services, and showed up at local barbecues, but never invited others deeply into their personal lives. For years, that discretion was interpreted as shyness or simple preference. No one suspected it was also the result of a carefully guarded secret that Laura carried. Michael's life revolved around work and routine. At 39 years old in 2022, he had spent nearly half his life fixing engines, repairing transmissions, and building trust with loyal customers at a small auto shop just off Interstate 35. He was the kind of man who believed in hard work, stability, and straight answers. Colleagues described him as dependable, though sometimes stubborn, a man who liked things simple and predictable. His evenings were often spent at home watching television, barbecuing on the weekends, or tinkering with cars in his garage. Laura, in contrast, was more private, though equally steady in her ways. At 41 years old, she presented herself as a woman who had lived through hardship and come out stronger. Her role as a receptionist at a dental clinic allowed her to keep a low profile, but those who worked with her said she was polite and professional. Still, she never shared much about her early life. No childhood stories, no mention of relatives, no social media presence that predated her move to Texas. Over the years, Michael accepted this as part of who she was, trusting that her silence about the past was simply a way of leaving behind a difficult history. The couple's marriage was not marked by luxury or drama. They lived comfortably within their means, paying bills on time and keeping their home modest but tidy. The absence of children drew quiet speculation in their neighborhood and extended circles, but whenever the subject came up, Michael and Laura would answer calmly. They had chosen not to start a family. Most people accepted that explanation without question, respecting their privacy. In truth, Michael sometimes wondered privately why Laura avoided the idea so firmly, but he had long ago stopped pressing. He assumed it was a matter of health or personal choice, and since their marriage was otherwise steady, he buried his curiosity. The turning point began with something seemingly small. In late July 2022, during a sweltering Texas afternoon, Michael decided to clean out the attic of their home. He had been meaning to clear the space for months, especially as old boxes piled up. While sifting through stacks of papers, old receipts, and discarded items, he stumbled upon a sealed folder tucked into a plastic container. Out of habit, he opened it, expecting to find old bills or forgotten tax documents. Instead, he discovered medical records, documents that bore Laura's name but carried details that froze him in place. The paperwork, dated decades earlier, referred to hormone therapy, gender transition surgery, and legal name changes. The words were clinical but unmistakable. As Michael read line after line, the truth became clear. His wife of 10 years had been born male. For several minutes, he sat stunned in the attic's oppressive heat, staring at the papers in disbelief. His heart raced, his breathing turned shallow, and his sense of reality shifted. That discovery planted a seed of turmoil that grew rapidly in the days that followed. At first, Michael told no one. He went about his daily routines with a stiff, distracted presence. At work, his colleagues noticed he was quieter than usual, distracted when handling repairs. At home, he watched Laura closely, his mind replaying the details of the documents he had found. Laura, unaware of his discovery, carried on as normal, preparing dinner, asking about his day, and speaking casually about small plans for the weekend. But Michael's perspective had changed. The woman he thought he knew, the wife he had shared a decade of life with, now appeared as someone entirely different in his mind. Every unanswered question from the past, every vague response Laura had given about her childhood or family, suddenly seemed like a deliberate cover-up. He felt betrayed, angry, and humiliated, not just by the secret itself but by the fact that he had lived with it unknowingly for 10 years. The tension escalated quickly. Friends and neighbors, though unaware of what was happening inside the Sanders household, began to notice subtle changes. Michael stopped joining casual gatherings and his usual polite greetings became curt. Laura seemed more tired, occasionally glancing at her husband with confusion when his demeanor turned cold. In private, arguments began to surface, small at first but increasingly sharp. This discovery and the emotional storm it unleashed set the stage for the tragic night that would soon follow. For Michael, the truth about Laura's past was more than he could process. For Laura, the fear of losing the life she had built, the identity she had embraced, and the marriage she valued began to weigh heavily. In a city where appearances and reputations mattered, The private turmoil of one couple was about to become a public tragedy that would echo far beyond Waco. The summer heat in Texas often carried a suffocating weight, and on the night of August 3, 2022, the Sanders home on Cedar Ridge Drive felt heavier than usual. The air conditioning hummed, struggling against the thick humidity that seeped through the walls. Inside, Michael sat at the kitchen table, staring at the folder of medical records he had moved from the attic to his desk drawer days earlier. For nearly a week, he had lived with the knowledge of Laura's past, and the pressure of silence had become unbearable. That evening, after finishing dinner in tense quiet, Michael reached the breaking point. Laura was rinsing dishes at the sink when Michael pulled the folder from the drawer and placed it firmly on the table. His movements were slow, deliberate, and filled with the kind of finality that made Laura freeze. She turned, her hands still wet, and saw the papers spread out before him. For a long moment, the room was silent except for the steady hum of the air conditioner. Michael's voice broke the stillness. Low, heavy, and tinged with anger, he asked the question that had consumed him, "What is this?" His hand pressed against the documents, his eyes fixed on her. Laura's face paled as she recognized the folder. She had believed it was buried and forgotten, hidden among old boxes in a place Michael would never bother to search. Now, the past she had guarded so carefully was laid bare on the kitchen table. She hesitated before answering, but the hesitation itself only fueled Michael's rage. He demanded an explanation, his tone growing sharper with every word. Laura, her voice trembling, tried to explain the truth, how she had transitioned decades ago, how she had wanted to live fully as herself, how she had chosen silence not to deceive but to protect the life she had built. She spoke of survival, of fear, of wanting to be seen only for the woman she was, not for the past she had left behind. But for Michael, the explanation fell on deaf ears. The revelation was not a story of resilience in his eyes, it was a betrayal. Every moment of their 10-year marriage now appeared tainted. The anniversaries, the quiet dinners, the whispered promises before bed, suddenly they seemed like lies. His anger was not only directed at Laura but also at himself, for not seeing what he believed he should have noticed. The argument escalated quickly, spilling from the kitchen into the living room. Michael's voice grew louder, his words sharper, filled with accusations of dishonesty and humiliation. Laura pleaded with him to understand, her hands shaking as she tried to calm him. She reminded him of their years together, of the love they had shared, of the life they had built. But Michael's mind had already crossed a line from which there was no return. By 10:30 p.m., the shouting had grown so intense that a neighbor later reported hearing muffled arguments through the thin summer air, though at the time, they dismissed it as a marital dispute that would resolve itself. Inside the Sanders home, however, the fight reached a breaking point. Michael's rage turned physical. In the heat of the moment, blinded by anger and the weight of his own wounded pride, he struck Laura. The force of the blow sent her staggering, her pleas silenced by shock and fear. What followed was a rapid and brutal spiral. The argument no longer carried words but violence. Driven by fury, Michael lashed out again, and Laura struggled to defend herself. The living room became the stage of a tragedy, furniture shifted, objects knocked to the ground, until finally, in a moment of uncontrollable rage, Michael took Laura's life. The act was not planned in advance, but it was no less final. When the house fell silent, the reality of what had happened settled like a heavy weight. Michael stood over his wife's lifeless body, his chest heaving, his hands trembling. The documents still lay on the kitchen table, silent witnesses to the storm that had just consumed them both. The woman he had lived with for a decade, the partner who had shared his meals, his home, his bed, was gone. For several minutes Michael did nothing. He sat down, his mind clouded, his body heavy with shock. The air in the house seemed thicker, harder to breathe. He glanced at the clock. It was just past 11 p.m. outside. The neighborhood remained quiet, unaware of the tragedy that had unfolded within the beige house on the corner. It was not until nearly midnight that Michael attempted to act. He paced the living room, muttering to himself, unsure of what to do next. His hands bore faint traces of blood, and his shirt was stained. He considered calling someone, family, police, anyone, but fear and shame held him back. Instead, he wandered aimlessly through the house, replaying the argument in his mind, convincing himself that he had been provoked, that the betrayal justified the outcome. By morning, Michael's silence broke. At 6:45 a.m. on August 4, 2022, he called 911. His voice was strained, broken, and unsteady as he told the operator that his wife was unresponsive. Emergency responders arrived within minutes, their sirens cutting through the quiet of the neighborhood. Paramedics rushed into the home, but it was too late. Laura Sanders, age 41, was pronounced dead at the scene. As officers from the Waco Police Department entered the house, they quickly recognized signs of struggle: overturned furniture, scattered belongings, and bruises on Laura's body. Michael sat slumped on the couch, silent and dazed. When questioned, he offered fragments of explanation, his words disjointed, filled with anger, sorrow, and shock. Within hours, he was taken into custody. News of the arrest spread quickly across Waco. By midday, local media outlets began reporting that a man had been arrested in connection with the death of his wife. At first, it was described as a domestic dispute turned violent. But as investigators began piecing together the events, the truth behind the argument, and the secret that had been uncovered, would soon come to light, transforming the case from a private tragedy into a headline-grabbing story that stirred debate far beyond the city limits of Texas. When the call first came in on the morning of August 4, 2022, dispatchers treated it as another case of an unresponsive spouse. Domestic emergencies were not uncommon in Waco, and often paramedics arrived to find medical issues rather than criminal ones. But within minutes of stepping into the Sanders home, first responders realized this was far more serious. Laura Sanders, age 41, was lying lifeless in the living room. Her body showed clear signs of trauma: bruising on her face and arms, marks along her neck, and injuries consistent with a violent struggle. The overturned coffee table and scattered household items painted a picture of chaos. Michael Sanders was seated on the couch when officers entered, his face pale, his shirt wrinkled and stained. He appeared dazed, his eyes red as if he had not slept. When asked what happened, his responses were fragmented. "We argued," he muttered. "She lied. Everything was a lie." Detectives noted the agitation in his voice and the way his hands trembled. Though he claimed his wife had collapsed after the argument, the physical evidence suggested otherwise. By 7:30 a.m., the Waco Police Department had secured the scene. Crime scene tapes surrounded the modest beige house on Cedar Ridge Drive as neighbors gathered on their lawns, whispering in disbelief. To them, Michael and Laura had always seemed like a quiet couple. The flashing lights of patrol cars and the grim expressions of investigators hinted at something far darker than anyone could imagine. Detectives from the homicide unit were called in. Among them was Detective Angela Ruiz, a seasoned investigator known for her meticulous approach. She surveyed the living room carefully, noting the position of the body, the broken lamp on the floor, and the medical folder still lying open on the kitchen table. The folder immediately caught her attention. It seemed out of place, its clinical papers spread in a way that suggested it had been at the center of the argument. Ruiz instructed her team to bag it as evidence. Meanwhile, forensic technicians documented the scene, photographing every detail and collecting fingerprints. Preliminary assessments indicated Laura had died from blunt force trauma combined with asphyxiation, though the final cause of death would be confirmed by autopsy. To the investigators, the circumstances already pointed strongly toward domestic homicide. Michael was taken into custody for questioning later that morning. At the Waco Police Department, he sat in a small, dimly lit interrogation room. His demeanor shifted between anger and sorrow. When pressed about the fight, he admitted to confronting Laura about lies she had kept from him. Detectives probed further, asking what he meant. That was when Michael revealed the discovery he had made in the attic: the medical records detailing Laura's gender transition. His voice cracked with anger as he described feeling betrayed, humiliated, and deceived. Detectives listened carefully, documenting his words. For them, the motive began to take shape. What had initially appeared to be a generic domestic dispute was now a case with deeper social and personal layers. Michael's discovery of Laura's past, combined with his inability to accept it, had fueled the argument that ended in violence. By early afternoon, the story began to leak to the press. Local reporters stationed outside the police department picked up details from unofficial sources, and within hours headlines spread: Waco man arrested in wife's death, discovery of transgender identity at center of case. The revelation stunned the community. Neighbors who had known Laura for years expressed shock. Some said they had no idea, Others remarked that it didn't matter, while a few whispered judgmentally about the secrecy. Inside the department, detectives continued their work. Laura's medical history was reviewed, confirming the transition had taken place more than 20 years earlier, long before she met Michael. Legal documents verified that her gender and name had been changed lawfully. Friends and co-workers were interviewed, many of whom described Laura as kind, hardworking, and private about her personal life. None recalled her ever discussing her past. Investigators also began examining the Sanders marriage in greater detail. Financial records showed no unusual strain. Phone records revealed no evidence of affairs or hidden relationships. Instead, the tension seemed to hinge solely on the revelation of Laura's identity and Michael's reaction to it. This clarity narrowed the case. The motive was personal betrayal, at least in Michael's eyes, and the violence was fueled by rage rather than financial gain or premeditated intent. As the day wore on, the district attorney's office became involved. Given the sensitivity of the case, officials anticipated heightened public attention. Prosecutors discussed possible charges, ranging from second-degree murder to manslaughter, depending on the evidence and how the confrontation was interpreted in court. They knew the case would not only involve questions of violence but also ignite debates about gender identity, honesty, and the definition of betrayal in a marriage. Meanwhile, the autopsy was scheduled for the following day at the Travis County Medical Examiner's office. The findings would confirm the precise cause of death and either strengthen or weaken Michael's claim that the incident had not been intentional. Investigators, however, already felt confident that the evidence pointed toward deliberate violence. As evening fell on August 4th, the Sanders home remained cordoned off. Neighbors left flowers on the sidewalk, shaken by the thought that someone they had exchanged polite greetings with was now gone in such a violent manner. The street, usually filled with children's laughter and the hum of sprinklers, was unusually quiet. Back at the police station, Detective Ruiz reviewed the timeline again. Michael's discovery in the attic, the confrontation late on August 3rd, the violent escalation, and his 911 call hours later. Each detail built the case against him piece by piece. To Ruiz, the motive was painfully clear. An eruption of rage after years of ignorance collided with a truth Michael could not accept. The initial investigation had done its job. The crime was documented, the suspect was in custody, and the motive had begun to emerge. But beneath the surface, detectives sensed there was more to unravel. The case was not only about a marriage torn apart by secrets but also about the societal weight of identity, prejudice, and the destructive power of shame. The stage was set for revelations that would push the investigation and the trial to even darker and more complicated territory. As the investigation deepened, detectives believed they had a straightforward case. A husband, enraged by a personal discovery, lashed out and killed his wife during a heated argument. But as with many homicide cases, the deeper they dug, the more complicated the story became. The turning point arrived on August 6, 2022, when the Travis County Medical Examiner's office released the preliminary autopsy report. The findings confirmed that Laura Sanders had died from a combination of blunt force trauma and strangulation. But what surprised investigators was the detail about timing. The report suggested that the fatal injuries had not occurred in a single outburst of violence but over a span of time, indicating repeated assaults. This contradicted Michael's early suggestion that the fight had escalated suddenly and spiraled out of control. Instead, it pointed toward a more prolonged and deliberate attack. Detective Angela Ruiz reviewed the report carefully. To her, this meant Michael's defense, that he had lost control in the heat of the moment, would be harder to sustain. It suggested intent, persistence, and a refusal to stop even as Laura struggled for her life. But that was not the only twist. Forensic technicians also uncovered something unusual in the Sanders home. While combing through Laura's personal belongings, they discovered a second set of documents stored in a locked drawer inside her desk. These were not medical papers but personal letters, some addressed to an old friend from Houston. The letters, though never mailed, revealed Laura's growing fear that Michael might one day uncover her past. In one letter dated March 2021, Laura wrote, "Sometimes I feel the walls closing in. He asks questions I cannot answer without risking everything. I love him, but I don't know if he would still see me as me if he ever knew the whole truth." Another, written just weeks before her death, read, "I keep thinking about those old files in the attic. I should burn them, but part of me feels too guilty. What if he finds them? What if it all ends in anger? I'm scared of what he might do. These letters, though private and unsent, painted a haunting picture. Laura had not only feared exposure but also anticipated the danger such exposure could bring. For detectives, the letters became crucial evidence. They suggested Laura had lived with the weight of secrecy and fear for years, sensing the potential for violence long before it happened. Meanwhile, the investigation into Michael's state of mind uncovered another twist. Detectives traced his digital footprint in the weeks leading up to the murder. Internet history from his phone and laptop showed late-night searches for topics like how to handle betrayal, spouse lies about past, and more disturbingly, legal consequences of killing someone in self-defense. The searches, dated July 30th through August 2nd, suggested that Michael had not only been stewing in anger but also considering violent outcomes before the fatal night. This undermined any claim that the killing was spontaneous or purely impulsive. When confronted with these findings during a follow-up interrogation, Michael's demeanor shifted. He grew defensive, insisting that he had never planned to kill Laura. He argued that his searches were driven by desperation, that he was looking for answers to feelings he couldn't control. Still, the evidence painted a troubling picture. The prosecution now had stronger grounds to pursue a murder charge rather than manslaughter. The twist reached beyond the investigation and into the public sphere. As media outlets reported the details, the case ignited widespread debate. Advocacy groups for transgender rights highlighted Laura's letters as proof of the fear many transgender individuals face, even within intimate relationships. They argued that her death symbolized the real dangers of secrecy, prejudice, and rejection. On the other side, some voices, particularly on local talk radio, framed the story as one of deception, suggesting Michael had been trapped in a marriage built on lies. The narrative quickly became polarized, each side using the case to fuel broader social arguments. In Waco itself, the community wrestled with the revelations. Neighbors who had once described Michael as quiet and hardworking now questioned how well they truly knew him. Some admitted they had noticed his temper in small ways before, the quick flash of anger when frustrated, the way he sometimes snapped at Laura in public, but never imagined it could end in murder. For others, the shock lay in Laura's secret, a truth she had carried silently while trying to live an ordinary life. For Detective Ruiz and her team, the midpoint twist clarified the stakes. What began as a domestic violence case was evolving into a high-profile trial that would carry implications beyond the Sanders household. The evidence, the autopsy, the letters, the internet history, painted a story not of a sudden snap, but of building resentment, fear, and possible premeditation. The prosecution prepared to argue that Michael had been contemplating violence even before August 3rd, making the crime not just tragic but deliberate. By the second week of August, Michael Sanders was formally charged with second-degree murder, though prosecutors hinted that they might elevate it to first-degree if more evidence supported premeditation. His bail hearing drew reporters from across Texas, filling the courthouse with cameras and microphones. Laura's story, her hidden past, her private fears, and her violent death, was now firmly in the public eye. For Michael, sitting in an orange jumpsuit at the county jail, the weight of his actions seemed to press heavier each day. He told his public defender that he had simply lost control, but the growing body of evidence told another story, one that suggested his rage had been simmering, waiting for the moment when truth collided with pride. The midpoint twist reframed everything. This was no longer a simple story of a marriage broken by a secret, but a tragic convergence of fear, identity, and rage that spiraled into one of the most talked-about murder cases in Texas that summer. By late August 2022, the Sanders case had grown into a storm that stretched far beyond Waco. What began as a domestic homicide was now a headline across Texas and soon the entire country. Local newspapers carried daily updates, while national outlets debated the larger questions raised by the case: identity, secrecy, trust, and violence. Every new detail uncovered by investigators or leaked from court filings seemed to feed the fire. For prosecutors, the challenge was clear. They needed to prove that Michael Sanders had not merely lost his temper in a moment of passion but had acted with intent. The autopsy results, Laura's private letters, and Michael's internet search history were key pillars of their case. Together, they painted the picture of a man stewing in resentment and anger, who had considered the consequences of violence before acting on them. Prosecutors argued this was not a sudden snap, but the culmination of suspicion, rage, and refusal to accept his wife's truth. Michael's defense team, however, sought to reframe the narrative. His public defender, soon joined by a more experienced attorney hired by relatives, argued that Michael had been blindsided by a revelation that struck at the core of his marriage. They described him as a hard-working man, betrayed after 10 years of supposed honesty. According to them, Michael's actions were not calculated but the product of extreme emotional distress. They pushed for the lesser charge of manslaughter, insisting that the killing was impulsive, fueled by shock and humiliation rather than premeditation. As pretrial hearings began in September 2022, the courtroom became the battleground for these competing narratives. Reporters filled the benches, scribbling notes as lawyers debated motions and evidence. The defense sought to exclude Laura's personal letters, arguing they were private thoughts never meant to be shared, and that presenting them would prejudice the jury. Prosecutors countered that the letters were vital, demonstrating Laura's fear of her husband's potential for violence. Judge Elaine Turner ultimately ruled in favor of the prosecution, allowing the letters to be admitted. The decision made headlines the next day, with one outlet writing, "Fearful words, victims' letters to play central role in Waco murder trial." Outside the courthouse, tensions escalated. Advocacy groups gathered on the courthouse steps, holding vigils for Laura and demanding justice. Signs bearing messages like, "Protect trans lives," and "Truth is not a death sentence" became common sights. On the other side, a smaller but vocal group expressed sympathy for Michael, framing him as a victim of deception. The courthouse lawn became a microcosm of a larger cultural debate, one that prosecutors feared could seep into jury deliberations. Michael, meanwhile, sat in the McLennan County Jail awaiting trial. Those who visited him, including his brother and a few close friends, described a man consumed by bitterness. He maintained that he had been provoked, insisting he had not known what kind of life Laura had lived before their marriage. In private, he vacillated between anger and self-pity, blaming Laura for her secrecy while also portraying himself as someone pushed beyond his breaking point. Detective Angela Ruiz, still closely involved in preparing the prosecution's case, reflected on the evidence with growing conviction. To her, the story was tragically clear. Laura had built a life defined by silence and self-protection, fearing that disclosure could destroy her happiness. Michael, confronted with a truth he could not reconcile with his pride and values, had chosen violence over understanding. It was a collision of two realities, one shaped by survival, the other by resentment, that ended in tragedy. The rising conflict was not confined to the legal arena. The media coverage intensified, dissecting every detail of Laura's transition and Michael's reaction. Some reports focused heavily on Laura's identity, often sensationalizing aspects of her medical history. Others emphasized the broader issue of domestic violence, pointing out that secrecy should never justify murder. Talk shows debated whether Michael's feelings of betrayal could ever be considered mitigating, while advocacy groups condemned such framing as dangerous and dehumanizing. By October 2022, jury selection loomed and tensions only grew. Prosecutors prepared to present a narrative of premeditation, fueled by Michael's internet searches and the drawn-out nature of the assault. The defense prepared to lean heavily on Michael's state of mind, painting him as a man overwhelmed by shock, a victim of emotional turmoil rather than a calculating killer. Both sides knew the outcome would hinge on how the jury perceived not only the facts but also the context, the complexity of identity, trust, and personal betrayal. As trial preparations continued, new questions arose about Laura's decision to keep her past hidden. Prosecutors insisted her choice was rooted in survival and fear of rejection, while the defense suggested it was a form of deception. The courtroom, already heavy with tension, promised to become a stage for these larger societal debates. The rising conflict reached its peak on November 1, 2022, when the trial date was officially set. Outside the courthouse, hundreds gathered, their chants and signs echoing across downtown Waco. Inside, Judge Turner reminded both sides that the case would be decided on facts, not public opinion. Still, everyone knew the jury would carry into the courtroom the weight of the cultural storm surrounding the case. For the Sanders family, the conflict was deeply personal. Michael's relatives struggled to reconcile the man they knew with the accusations against him. Laura's few friends and co-workers, devastated by her loss, braced themselves for the public dissection of her private life. What had begun as a violent night inside a modest beige house was now a public spectacle, one that promised to reveal not only the details of a crime but the raw tensions of a society still grappling with identity, secrecy, and acceptance. The stage was set for the trial, and with it, the final act of the Sanders tragedy. The trial of Michael Sanders began on December 5, 2022, inside the McLennan County Courthouse. For 2 weeks, the courtroom was packed with reporters, activists, and members of the public who wanted to witness the outcome of a case that had gripped not only Waco but also much of Texas. The atmosphere was tense, every detail of testimony magnified by the weight of national attention. Prosecutors laid out their case with precision. They presented the autopsy report showing repeated injuries, the private letters in which Laura expressed her fear, and Michael's internet search history that revealed his growing obsession with violence and consequences. They argued that these elements proved Michael's actions were not a momentary lapse of control but a deliberate choice. The prosecution's closing statement was stark. This was not about deception. This was about rage. A woman's life was taken because her truth was discovered and not accepted. The defense, in turn, leaned heavily on Michael's emotional state. They painted him as a man blindsided by a revelation that shattered the foundation of his marriage. They described his reaction as human, though tragic, claiming that he was pushed into an uncontrollable storm of shock, anger, and confusion. In their closing, the defense pleaded with the jury to see the killing as the product of passion, not premeditation, and to reduce the charge to manslaughter. When the jury retired to deliberate, the courthouse fell into a hushed waiting. Reporters gathered outside, broadcasting live updates, while crowds stood in clusters on the courthouse steps, holding candles and signs. Inside, Laura's co-workers sat silently in the gallery, clutching tissues, while Michael's brother sat with his head bowed. After 9 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with its decision. On December 19, 2022, Michael Sanders was found guilty of second-degree murder. The courtroom erupted, some with relief, others with sorrow. Laura's friends wept quietly, holding each other, while Michael sat motionless as the verdict was read, his face pale, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. At sentencing the following week, Judge Elaine Turner addressed Michael directly. Her voice was firm but solemn. This court recognizes the complexity of the circumstances, but no revelation, no matter how personal, ever justifies taking a life. The choice you made ended a life and tore apart a community. For that, you must be held accountable. Michael was sentenced to 35 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 20. The verdict closed the legal chapter of the Sanders case, but its echoes continued. Advocacy groups cited Laura's story as a reminder of the dangers many transgender individuals face, even in their most intimate relationships. Commentators debated the fine line between privacy and disclosure, and whether Laura's silence had been self-preservation or deception. For neighbors on Cedar Ridge Drive, the beige house on the corner became a haunting symbol of how quickly an ordinary life could collapse under the weight of hidden truths. As winter settled over Waco, the media eventually moved on to new stories, but for those who had known Laura, her absence lingered. A small memorial was placed at the edge of the neighborhood park. Flowers, candles, and a plaque that read, "In memory of Laura Sanders, loved and remembered." For Michael, prison walls became his new reality, a constant reminder of the night when anger silenced reason. In the end, the Sanders case stood not only as a criminal tragedy but also as a stark reminder of how fragile trust can be, and how the collision of secrecy and pride can lead to irreversible consequences. Backhand index pointing right, that's the final part, ending, bringing the story to a close with over 400 words.